Greetings. My name is Dr. Rahman, and welcome to Black Women's Health Podcast. I am honored today to have a very special guest with me, Dr. Dorothy Chu, who has been involved in a very interesting study that she will share her findings with us. So welcome, Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. Sorry. I am very honored to have the invitation to come talk with you today.
So before we get into the study, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What type of doctor are you?
Sure. So my doctorate is not an MD, is not a doctor that you would go see if you're looking for someone to kind of, if you have a cold or diabetes or something like that. I study public health, and so I did a lot of training in public health nutrition specifically at Johns Hopkins, and I guess did my dissertation there, diet and social-emotional and academic performance outcomes in a national sample of US children, specifically fifth graders. And after I completed that defense, then I got my doctorate. So just a doctorate in public health nutrition.
Public health nutrition.
Yes.
Okay, fascinating. Your study, which is what caught my eye, is entitled Essential Nutrients, Added Sugar Intake in Epigenetic Age in Midlife Black and White Women.
Yes.
Now, that's a lot. So if you could just break this down, what do you mean by epigenetics?
So epigenetics is a really cool concept. As you might guess from the inclusion of the word genetic in that word, epigenetic, it has to do with our DNA material. Epigenetics is this modification that happens to our DNA. It doesn't change our sequence of DNA, but there are changes that can happen to how our genes, as they're encoded in the DNA, are turned on and off, how the genes are expressed, how our body functions, that can be modified based on what we're exposed to throughout our life. So one of those things is lifestyle factors. So diet would be one of them. And specifically, there's multiple kinds of modifications that can happen. But our study looked at specifically DNA methylation, where a methyl group, which is just a chemical structure, gets attached to the part of the DNA that turns a gene on and off. And over time, those methyl groups attach themselves or detach in a certain pattern. And some researchers who specialize in this field were able to kind of study them and correlate them with different health outcomes. And in our case, they were able to tie it in with morbidity and mortality risk. So how likely we are to have a chronic disease or chronic conditions, how well our body functions, and also our risk to death. And so they were very clever in their naming of this pattern, or clock, as they call it. It's like how old we are, how far along the clock we are epigenetically. And they called it GrimAge 2. There was an earlier version of GrimAge, but this is the updated version that we used in our study. So GrimAge as in Grim.
So I am going to try to explain my understanding.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you to correct me, because this is really fascinating. So I'm going to start off with the fact that we have skin cells and we have muscle cells and we have cells that are in our liver, and each of these cells have the same DNA.
Yes.
Even though they look different, they have different function, but they all have the same DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
exactly. Yeah.
What makes them different or gives them their particular function is whether a certain part of the DNA is turned on or it's turned off.
Right. Yes.
Okay. So it's the same DNA, but depending on what you turn on or what you turn off, you get a different expression or you get a different type of cell.
Totally. Yes.
Epigenetics has to do with not changing the DNA sequence, but rather changing the chemicals that might turn on a cell or part of a cell or turn it off.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a particular DNA methylation.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
And
that's one type of modification that
okay,
happens.
so the
Mhm.
DNA methylation can modify the expression of of a cell. It can turn proteins on or it can turn proteins off.
Mhm. Yeah, genes
Okay.
or proteins on and off.
All right.
Mhm.
So you're not changing the DNA, you're just either adding a particular chemical or taking it away, and that chemical is either turning on or turning off parts of the DNA.
Right.
Okay, but what's interesting about that is that these changes, even though they're not occurring to the DNA, they are epigenetic changes. These are chemicals that are being added or subtracted.
Yes.
And the breakthrough moment is when we realize that certain things that we do, certain things that we are exposed to can either turn on or turn off these epigenetic changes, which will change how our body functions,
Yes, exactly. Right.
which is huge when you think about it, which
Hmm.
is where your work comes in. And you're saying your work has shown that what we eat
Hmm.
can result in epigenetic changes, which can then result in how which can affect our health.
Totally. Yes.
Always heard that, eating the right food is good for us and, strong bones and teeth and we're healthy, but this is actually kind of showing how that happens.
Yes, kind of. It shows a link between, yeah, our behaviors and the health outcome that we see. And so it gives us a little more insight into.
The GrimAge 2 clock looks at epigenetic changes.
Mhm.
And then, depending on whether there are a lot of changes or certain specific changes, it helps to determine your biological age,
Yes. Hmm.
which then helps to predict your chances of having some sort of morbidity and or mortality.
There's certain patterns, the way that I understand it, there's certain patterns that emerge over time and they correlate with those patterns of risk. And so they were able to kind of, the folks who developed the GrimAge clock, for example, they were able to kind of take those patterns and transform that data into like, okay, this is your biological age of 61 years when you're
Right.
like maybe.
Because we don't all age at the same rate.
Exactly.
We know people that look young for their age or look old for their age.
Right.
Instead of basing someone's mortality on their age alone, you
Mm-hmm.
can look at certain or you can look for certain epigenetic changes and then based on that
Mm-hmm.
predict, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if that's a good word,
Yeah.
predict the likelihood of them dying, blunt about it.
Yeah, I think that's why they called it GrimAge because it's like a grim sort of outcome. But
So
in a way, yeah.
do you have a sense of how common that is? Most people don't go to their doctor's office and ask for their grim age.
Yeah. It's very new. I think it's very, very new. I think it seems like it's mostly used in research settings. I was online the other day and I noticed that you can kind of commercially request
Oh,
tests and they're like maybe 500 or so dollars. I think like in this
oh,
era of personalized medicine, there's more companies who are bringing those sorts of things that we can kind of pay out of pocket for. So like the food
yeah. I mean,
sensitivity test, like the
it's a
GrimAge.
little frightening, but I guess if you got your GrimAge and
Hmm.
realized that it was higher or lower, I don't even know how, if it was not what you wanted it to be, you
Yeah.
could start to institute changes
Hmm.
that might help to improve your
Exactly.
GrimAge.
I
I
believe
mean,
so. Yeah,
and that's a whole new way of approaching healthcare.
exactly.
It's fascinating. But
It's
back to
very
your
exciting.
study.
Yeah.
You were looking at nutrition
Hmm.
and how nutrition affected the grim age.
How it associated
How
with
is
it.
it? Okay, if you would just explain the design of your study and then go into your findings.
Sure. Just to touch on what we were just talking about before, it is kind of empowering to know that if our bodies might not be what we want them to be now, we could change habits and maybe make it better or try and make it better. So, kind of with that philosophy in mind, there's a lot of there's an emerging field of nutri-epigenetics or nutrigenetics, where the premise is that nutrition will lifestyle factors, specifically nutrition and diet, will kind of impact your epigenetics. And so, kind of in that field, the diet that has been very hot is the Mediterranean diet, and it's linked with younger biological age. And so, we had this really unique cohort of Northern Californian women in that they were first recruited when they were kids. They were like age 9 and 10, and they this group of researchers followed them for a while. And so this cohort exists. And now in this day and age, we're able to kind of kind of go along with the research advances and calculate GrimAge. And so throughout this time, we have been, or the group rather, has been taking data on their diet. And so they had really, really great diet data for these women. And diet data is pretty hard to assess sometimes, but the design of their study or the study was such that the women were so at this point in time, they were around middle aged, age 36 to 43, and they were asked to complete a 3-day food record and record everything that they ate from the morning, from the time that they woke up to the time that they went to sleep. And we had 3 days worth of diet data, and we sent it off to be analyzed. And then when we came back, we were able to get enough data to calculate things like the Mediterranean diet score, like how aligned with the Mediterranean diet folks, these women were eating. We also looked at the alternate healthy eating index, which is guidelines that exist to prevent chronic disease. So we scored their diets in a variety of ways. So for Mediterranean diet, for the alternate healthy eating index, we also created this novel index called the Epigenetic nutrient index, highlighting nutrients that seem specifically active in epigenetic health, antioxidant nutrients, anti-inflammatory nutrients, and then nutrients that are very active in DNA repair and maintenance. So we looked at the diet health in a variety of different ways, so 3 ways. And then we also were really interested in sugar, because it's a known inflammatory, oxidative stress agent in the body, and we know that consumption of added sugars is pretty high.
Ubiquitous, yes.
Pretty
Yeah,
high. And
yeah.
so we wanted to look at all these known factors of inflammation, oxidative stress, and just like health in general in the body, and relate it to GrimAge too, because we had really great diet data. We had this really robust epigenetic marker, and we just wanted to tie it together. And we had a really great cohort of women. It was 342 women. Half
Can I
were,
ask you about that? You said they were introduced into a study when they were much younger.
yes, they were. So they, in the initial, when the study was born, it was the 1990s, and it was of interest then, to kind of discern determinants of obesity, I guess, because obesity was up and coming, and they're trying to figure out why are we seeing so many like weight changes, and are there social,
Okay.
yeah,
And so
so
at this point, they're young girls.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
like
at that point in
nine.
the 90s.
Yeah, they're like 9 and 10 years old.
Exactly.
And then they're followed every year.
So they were followed between age 9 to 19. So for about 10 years, they were followed very closely. And then there was a break. And then nothing really happened in significantly anyway until about 2015. And then I guess the cohort was revived. And so the Northern California group, it's actually it originally at the impetus was three sites, like one in Cincinnati, one in I think DC area, and one in Northern California. So it was a bigger study. But the researchers in California were like, hey, we should maybe tap into that group again. And so
Okay.
they reached out to the Just the California Women.
And that group,
Mhm.
they were now about 39 years old, or the median age was 39.
And our hypothesis was that healthier diets more aligned with recommendations for healthy eating would be associated with younger biological age, so younger grim age.
A younger grim age, which
Yeah.
translates into healthier living longer.
Yes, yeah, a lower mortality, morbidity risk.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So 342 women.
Mm-hmm. 342 women. It was really unique because they were half black and half white, and I think a lot of the studies to date have been limited to more older and white populations. So it was kind of nice to bring it down to middle age and a more diverse sample so that we could expand the generalizability of our results. And what we found was that what our hypothesis was, as we expected, like healthier diets were associated with younger biological age.
So your study was remarkable. You kind of said that real fast, but I just want to highlight the point that there's been so much talk about not enough research involving women. And this
Mhm,
research involved middle-aged women, which is even probably more rare.
mhm,
And the demographics were half of the women were Black,
mhm,
which is almost unheard of in any type of study, that for
mhm,
your participants to be half Black and the other half were white. And so this is kind of very unusual. And
mhm,
so you're saying we've looked at the diets and we've calculated their grim age,
mhm,
and our hypothesis is if they have a good diet,
mhm,
that they'll have a lower grim age, which
mhm.
translates into lower mortality,
Right. Risk.
which is kind of, but you had an extra piece to that. You said, we also want to calculate or compare their sugar intake and whether the sugar intake, irrespective of their diet, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Whether that affected their grim age, which affects your morbidity and mortality.
Exactly. Because in the real world, we don't all eat very healthily. We all don't eat unhealthily. We eat in a mix. And so we kind of wanted to capture the effects or the associations when we kind of take that into consideration. So like given that someone is eating this healthily, but their added sugar intake is X, like is there still an association? And we did find that yes, both of those components, the healthy and the less healthy, have an association with with your biological age. So so you're not out of the woods almost if you eat healthily. Like if you're still eating the sugar, you're still going to kind of like counteract some of what you're doing. But at the same time, if you're eating sugar but you're eating healthily, you're kind of counteracting those effects too.
Does one have a more predominant effect? So if I'm following a Mediterranean diet, but I love sweets
Right.
and my sugar intake is high, does
Mhm.
that negate the Mediterranean diet, or does the Mediterranean diet outweigh all of the sugar I'm eating?
So I would say it depends on your amounts of both. Like how healthy, how high is that Mediterranean, like how aligned are you with that dietary pattern? And then how much sugar are you eating? Because I guess what ends up mattering is the net effect.
The net
Um,
effect.
yeah, but at the same time, sugar definitely has a strong effect, but I think the nutrients or the healthy diet has a slightly larger effect, especially with the Mediterranean diet. So, depending on your intake, again, of everything, aligned with the Mediterranean diet or patterns like the Mediterranean diet, you're probably in a good space. But if you're eating like a brownie, a ice cream, a candy bar, like soda, every single day, then it's harder and harder for that diet to kind of like counteract, which
I think the American Heart Association has said that we all consume too much sugar.
right, yeah.
So we're already
Yeah,
way
we're
over.
over. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And which would mean that we are doing ourselves a true disservice based on your findings. We are we are changing our GrimAge score so that we are at a greater risk for morbidity and mortality by the amount of sugar that we eat.
Yeah. And in a way, like I guess we kind of knew that. This just adds more evidence to the fire that like people who ate more sugary foods like probably had more cardiovascular disease, had more diabetes. They, you know, they were at risk for a lot more other diseases. And this just kind of ties it like, oh, at the epigenetic level, yes, this is also apparent. Yes, I think definitely GrimAge scores correlate with age. So yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Uh, can we, I mean, I think there's somebody on YouTube now who's changing their diet and doing all sorts of things because they want to live forever and
Right,
don't die.
yeah.
Is that possible? I mean, can you change your, can you you can reverse your GrimAge score. You can improve it.
To a point, I think. Yeah, you can reverse some changes. You can kind of slow it down. I think you can slow it down, but I think our biology is very powerful. Our genetics are very powerful. So there's a lifestyle component, but I think there's also a genetic
That's
component.
fascinating. That's really
Yeah.
fascinating. So,
But eating healthfully, definitely there's power in that in terms of your health. And so eating a variety of foods, eating more nutrient dense foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats, eating a variety of foods so you get all those nutrients that will help your body do all the things that it needs to do to keep it functioning how as optimally as it can function. And added sugars, they they're definitely tasty. It's not a end all if you have some, but maybe it's kind of thinking about it within the context of like what else you're eating could be helpful. Um, yeah, but there's power. I think epigenetic changes, as you were saying, they're reversible and they're modifiable. So there we have power in that. It's not our genes don't dictate where we're going to end up. We can do things for ourselves. Yeah, no, thank you again for your interest. And I guess like I should say that these this is what's suggested. This is a cross-sectional study, unfortunately, so we don't have causality that we can actually pinpoint. it certainly suggests that. And so future research will kind of better get at causality and effects. And in our hypothesis, in our framework of how we were conceptualizing like what's happening, we said the diet came first and the epigenetic changes came second. But in reality, that's just how we set up our model. We could also do it the other way because they were both at the same time. So in the future, what I'm hoping to do is that we have diet data for these women at age 9 and 10.
Yes.
So I want to look at the longitudinal, like over time diet and how that affects their epigenetic age now and see what the association is. That would be the next step. So we haven't done that yet, but we're hoping to.
And that would lead more to the idea of causality.
Exactly, yeah. Because then we know for a fact that the diet came first, and we know that epigenetic age was after the fact.
Hmm.
And then I guess like even then that's not like definitive proof because then I think we need to do trials and like take out all the other variables that could have intervened in the way and then say like, okay, diet and then epigenetic age like in a controlled setting. So it's a little bit a ways, unfortunately, to say like is proof, but it's strong data to suggest that association, especially in the context of all that we know of diet and health.
So
Like,
that's very interesting. Just to talk about this a little bit more, your study, as strong as it is, just shows an association
yes,
between a particular diet and a GrimAge score.
exactly, yes.
And we believe, or the hypothesis was that the worsening of the GrimAge score was due to a diet that was not close to a Mediterranean diet, or that was due to added sugar.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so you're saying you would need to go back in time
Mm-hmm.
and follow these, see if there is an associated change before you would feel confident saying one caused the other.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't say anything about causality um, confidently, or it would, yeah, it is. Yeah, I think that's the nature of
Even with what we know about food and inflammation and sugar, you still feel that it needs that scientific rigor before you say anything.
that's a good question. I think, I think not always, but scientists a lot of the time are very cautious to just jump the gun, to so to speak, and say like, oh, this is what, even though it sounds like it seems like it's strongly suggesting it, it's still like, well, it could be something else. It could be something else. It makes me think of like the how observations become theory, and then theory becomes a law, and then so it's like there's just a more testing and like things that you have to throw at it to see if it's still sticking, I guess. So
Thank you for doing the study.
I hope to do part 2 and then maybe update you.
Please do.
Yeah,
That would be very interesting.
yeah, I would
Thank
love
you
to.
so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rama.
Take
Um,
care. Thank you, Dr. Chu.
The podcast was over, but we kept talking.
Or what would it take to make someone modify it? I guess that's really the question.
that's a really good question. I feel like that's
And I think the GrimAge score.
yeah, yeah. If
Yeah.
like if you did that,
If
then
I
you
went to the doctor and they said,
would.
your GrimAge score, and then I was like, what can I do? What can I do?
Yeah, that's true.
Cut back on sugar.
This
Yeah,
is
kind of
Dr.
like a blood
Rahman
pressure,
saying
like
until the next
like your
time,
doctor and they're
take
like, oh, your
care.
blood pressure is high, change your diet, and then you're